The president is visiting an empty museum. You know, the Humboldt Forum only is holding 10,000 of Majimaji War boots, goods that were looted during the Majimaji War. What the Majimaji Museum is in the museum it's showcasing is replicas, things that are created to imitate, what was, part of the Majimaji resistance. Now visiting that particular space without any action afterwards is completely mockery. So that's my reaction to that particular visit. It did not amount to anything tangible that we can see.
Welcome to a new episode of the podcast Decolonial Memories. I'm Thomas Fuß. Today I have the honor and pleasure to talk to Dr. Nancy Rushohora of the University of Dar es Salaam. Our conversation took place on the 10th of June 2026. Welcome to the podcast Decolonial Memories, Dr. Nancy Rushohora. Thank you very much for joining me in this conversation.
Thank you.
Can we start with some personal information, please? Where did you grow up? What educational career did you pass through? And what is your present work?
So I was born in Tanzania, and I was educated there for most of my, primary, secondary, and also the bachelor degree in Tanzania.
And which area, please, of which region of Tanzania?
So I was born in Moshi. I was born in Kilimanjaro. That's where I grew up. But in terms of decency, I come from Kagera.
Where is that approximately?
So I grew up in northeastern Tanzania, Kilimanjaro area, but my parents are from Kagera, which is northwestern part of Tanzania.
Okay, so then what educational steps did you take?
Yes, so normally we go from primary to secondary and then to university. So these are the levels that I also took. These are the steps that we take in Tanzania. So you start primary for 7 years, then you go to secondary for 6 years, and then you enter university. So those are the steps that I actually took before joining the University of Dar es Salaam for my bachelor degree.
In which field then did you take the bachelor?
So I did my studies in archaeology. So I was enrolled as a student of archaeology at the University of Dar es Salaam. And I also did a master's in archaeology at the University of Dar es Salaam.
And then you continued for a PhD?
Yes. So I did my PhD at the University of Pretoria in South Africa.
Also in archaeology?
Yes, in archaeology.
And then you returned to Tanzania. So what is your present occupation, position?
So I'm working at the University of Dar es Salaam as a lecturer in the Department of Archaeology and Heritage Studies. So through my studies, especially when I was in my second year of bachelor degree, I developed an interest into the historical archaeology. So from my BA already, I had started venturing into that field. However, at the University of Dar es Salaam, historical archaeology wasn't a strong field. And that's because of the history of Tanzania. Tanzania is very famous of, the archaeology that dates to the Paleolithic, Neolithic period, a deep history. Tanzania actually is considered one of the cradle of humankind. So this ancient archaeology is where most of the scholars at the University of Dar es Salaam and even foreigners who ventured into Tanzania were interested in. But I was lucky in my second year, one of the professors was venturing into historical archaeology. And that was the year that the Majimaji resistance was about to be 100. So it was the centenary of the Majimaji resistance. So during that period, I was opportuned to accompany him to the field to study the Majimaji resistance. And that was my interest. And I would say that maybe that was the best course that I took during my entire undergraduate studies. Because for the first time, I got to learn about this war that Tanzania is obsessed with. It is one of the war that comes in examinations. So in primary, secondary schools, this is a must-do a question in history examination. So you'll be asked about what is the Majimaji War, what are the effects of the Majimaji War, and pretty much that was it. That was the knowledge of the Majimaji War that we had. The fact that sites that were attributed to the Majimaji resistance are still available, descendant community are still living, and memorials have been installed to that matter was not in the curriculum, was not taught in schools. And that really drew my attention into this particular field.
Now, some of the listeners may not be so familiar with all the details about the Majimaji War. Could you please provide some information? When did it, how long did it last? When did it start? How many people were affected? What was the nature of that anti-colonial, a major anti-colonial war against German occupation?
So in Tanzania, we read about primary resistance and secondary resistance. These were the historians, the early historians of colonialism and its aftermath divided the resistances to colonialism in this form. And also they divided them into active resistance and passive resistances. So we study Majimaji as one of the active resistance against colonialism. And this is actually not studied in Tanzania alone. It is studied in Africa. The entire of Africa, the Majimaji War is taught. Now, what is it? It was a resistance against colonialism. These cotton plantations were established around 1902. And so people were forced to work in these plantations. And in this region, they had a very short period of famine. And it was that particular period of famine that also the Germans targeted for cotton plantation. So by the time that labor, the family labor was needed the most, it was the time that colonial labor was also needed the most. So people were terrified by the situation because there was violence involved in farming. And so they were terrified about how they are going to take themselves out of that circumstance. And it was already proven that because there were more than 50 resistances before the Majimaji resistance in Tanzania. So they had already observed the Makunganya resistance, whereby they failed. They had already witnessed the Machemba resistance, where they failed. So they knew that taking themselves out of this in a peaceful way was impossible. And so Kinjekitile Ngwale emerged with the medicine. So throughout 1904, they started preparing for the war, drinking medicine, and the medicine was believed to be a protection, a charm against the German bullets. It was anticipated that by using the medicine, the guns fired to them will not affect them.
May I add at this point, you diverging from most of the scholarly sources which I read regarding the beginning of the Majimaji resistance. You put it at the year 1904, is that right? 1904, and then it would last until 1908. So, by the way, this is also very much the period of the German genocidal war against Ovaherero and Nama people. So please continue on the resistance.
Yes, and also by that point, Van Trotter, before when
Lothar von Trotha,
Yes,
the
yes,
German
yes,
colonial
the German
officer,
colonial
infamous genocidal actor in Namibia.
in Namibia. Before going to Namibia, he was actually in Tanzania, and he's the one who initiated the war between the Makunganya and the people of Kilwa. This is also the same, the same region where Majimaji resistance started. So Van Trotter, it was after Kilwa that he went to Namibia. He was first in Tanzania. So this was the period before, and that's why I said it was the ammunition, the use of power was already seen by the people that it was difficult to defend themselves against the powerful military position of the Germans. And so the Kinjekitile Ngwale medicine was believed far and large. So in 1904, that's when the war started locally. That's what the war started. So the scholars who put it between 1905 and 1907, it is because they count from the actual breakup of the war, and also they count the end point that was declared by the Germans. So this is from the German documents that you see. It was declared in 1905, and also it was ended in 1907. But in 1904, from the community point of view, the war had already started and it was hidden. This was called a pilgrimage. It was like a pilgrimage going to Kinjekitile. And for them, these rituals were normal. It was a time of celebration. It was the time that these rituals were conducted. So to the Germans' eye, this was not something that they could worry about, but it was the actual preparation of the war. And in 1908, the war was still ongoing because people were hunted down, killed. People were forced to surrender until 1908. The only thing that was not there is that the community danger to the Germans had already been suppressed. And so to the Germans, the war was over, but to the local community, this was actually ongoing. 1908 was the end of hunting of the people, but the impact of the war went all the way to 1910 because of the hunger that was perpetrated as part of the war. And to some point, there are people who are still affected by the Majimaji resistance up to today.
Can you say something to the estimates of the victims, direct and indirect, related to Majimaji war?
Yes, because the Majimaji occurred in a part of the country that was not so much populated, because it is the area that also where the Selu Game Reserve came from. And so most of the people are in the Makonde Plateau, some of the part of the Gindo, Uluguru, and far north to Songea and Buguma. That's where most of the people are concentrated. An estimate of the people who died of the Majimaji war is between 300,000 to 500,000 by estimates. This
direct and indirect impact of the war.
The war, yes.
You also researched the role of the Christian missions and missionaries within the Majimaji war panorama. Can you say something about that?
Yes, because the missionaries were an accompaniment. They were accompaniment with the German administrators. So part of people who came to Tanzania were the missionaries. And during the Majimaji resistance, the missionaries had already established their, churches, residences. It was difficult for the local people to differentiate between the government administrators and the missionaries, because both were in possession of guns. Both used forced labor in their activities. Both changed the position. So, for example, an officer traveling from Dar es Salaam to Kilimanjaro, in the process of travel, they will sleep in churches and residences meant for missionaries. So during the war outbreak, there was no distinction between the administrators and the missionaries. And so the missionaries killed people as part of their defense, but also they were killed by the Majimaji warriors. However, they also provided help after the war, especially during hunger. We see so many people gathering around, missions, asking or begging for food and provisions that were no longer within their environment, but the churches could save some. Some of the documents indicate that sometimes they couldn't even offer anything because themselves they were also starving in the process.
You already mentioned that the impact, a long time impact of the Majimaji War still shows today. You went around and talked to communities. What is the evidence? What's the memory of the war, and how can you see the effects in today's society in southern Tanzania?
So one of the main impacts was population dispersal, or what do we say? The population that left because of the war. So most of the people migrated outside the Majimaji war zone because immediately after the war, development were completely not taken to the southern part or to the area that participated in the Majimaji. Unfortunately, even after the First World War, when Germany lost all her colonies in Tanzania or in other parts of Africa, when Germany lost all her colonies, the British also took the same approach. So they took all the developmental aids away from communities that were considered the rebel communities. So the communities that resisted. And so life in the southern part of Tanzania was completely difficult. The connection between Dar es Salaam or the eastern part of the country to the southern part of the country was only possible between 2005 and was completely opened in 2010. That is when the connection between the south and the eastern part of Tanzania was done. This is very recent. And so the development of southern part of Tanzania was completely ignored. And so most of the people moved away from these areas. And the area remained underdeveloped for years until now. In areas like Liwale, population also remained very small. That's because most of the people moved out of these areas. And so you can see this vividly until today. There is also denial. So for example, people completely participated. The descendants of victims of the Majimaji resistance, they are hiding themselves in fear of that maybe they'll be hunted down and asked of their participation during, the Majimaji resistance. So the grandchildren are hiding, claiming that they know nothing about the involvement in the Majimaji resistance, so that they can live their lives in peace without any, maybe, interaction, not interaction really, but without any interference from the government or the German government or the missionaries at large. In some parts, they have hidden the graves until very recently when commemorations became a thing. So they now reveal where the graves of their, grandfathers were, so that they can be part of the commemorations that are going on today. But when I was starting my research in 2007, all these were completely hidden from me, saying that there is no grave, there's no grave, there's no grave.
In the next section, we will go further into detail about your scholarly work on German colonialism. Nancy, how did you get so much interested in the period of German colonialism in your country, German East Africa at that time, that you made it into, let's say, the focal area of your scholarly work?
So my main entry into this period was the Majimaji War. So, like I said before, it was a topic that was a must know and a must do. So from primary to secondary, this is something that was taught in schools. And it is taught as, Kinjekitile Ngwale, as the leader. We actually used to call him the leader of the Majimaji resistance. And then the fact that there were causes, which is exploitation, land alienation, forced labor. These were the things that we used to cram and sing. And then the aftermath, the loss of people, and actually the nationalistic twist, that it was from the Majimaji resistance that Tanzania regained her independence without violence, because Nyerere learned from the Majimaji resistance that it was not possible, to win any fight against the colonialists. So the best approach is to use tabled negotiations. So the table negotiations were the ones that were used for Tanzania independence in 1961. So these were the lessons that were taught in schools, and that was pretty much it. Now, my first time entering to the Majimaji region and seeing all these, evidence that are still vivid, but never taught in schools, that was my really main interest. And during my bachelor degree, I actually wrote my first dissertation in the ethnographies of the Majimaji resistance in Tanzania, among the Matumbi, where the war actually started. So that was my entry into the Majimaji resistance, and that was my entry into the German colonial period. So from there, I started now to expand, because by then I did my BA, and actually my aim was to expose what is there at the local level against what is there in, curriculum and whatsoever. But through that, then I continued, researching more and more, and expanded into many other areas like the missionaries, the German, left monuments, and so many other things.
Can you say something about the role of women in the Majimaji War or other acts of resistance against German colonial rule?
So women were actually part of these resistances against the German colonial rule, or against colonialism at large, because they were living, with men. There were families living in the region, and so they were directly involved in these wars. There are some prominent ones who either took the position of leadership of the war. So, for example, for the Majimaji War, we have a woman, Nkomanile, Hadija Nkomanile. These are her names. So, Hadija Nkomanile was a sub-chief, the equivalence of Songeambano in the region of, among the Ngoni in Songea, or this region is called Ruvuma in Tanzania. It was through her that the Majimaji resistance actually entered Ruvuma or Songea and the entire southwestern parts of Tanzania. And these are among the Ngoni, the Bena, the Sangwa, all these southwestern part of the country. So ethnic groups that are in the southern western part of the country. The entrance was through Hadija Nkomanile, which was the gate between the Ngoni and the Mwera. So an ambassador was sent with the Majimaji medicine from Umwera, where Kijekitile Ngwale was, to Songea. And Nkomanile was the one who received the ambassador and took the ambassador to the chief, Chabruma. And then that's when it was negotiated, whether the Ngoni should join the war or not join the war. So she was actually killed by the Germans as part of this action, her involvement in the Majimaji resistance. And so far, she is one of the women who is known to have been killed because of her involvement in the Majimaji resistance. Now, there is a very big question around her death, execution process, and the final resting place of her body and its whereabouts. There are so many mysteries around Mkomanile, which I would like to highlight. So, for example, there is community and there is museum. There is a version of the museum and there is a version of the community.
You mean in Songea now?
In Songea,
In Songea.
yes. So her family in Kitanda is where she comes from, and their descendants are still there. And then in the museum, which is also in Songea, the Majimaji War Museum. So at the family level, they point to a canyon. They point to a canyon saying that after she was killed by the Germans, she was thrown in that canyon. She was thrown in that canyon, and that's where they believe was her final resting place. At the museum, her name is included among the 66, victims of the Majimaji resistance. Although it is known that she was not hanged there, she was not hanged on the same date as them. She was hanged in 1905 before the hanging, the mass execution of the rest of the victims of the Majimaji resistance. And also, others are photographed. They are seen in a photo that a missionary, Father Johannes Hafliger, took of the victims of the Majimaji resistance. Her photo is not part of that. So we don't know the photo. We have never seen the photo of Nkomanile. We don't know where exactly Nkomanile was hanged. We don't know under which circumstances Nkomanile was hanged. We also do not know whether her remains are really in that canyon or actually they were looted and taken to German. Like other women, like Liti Kidanka, we know that her remains were actually taken, and she was also at the forefront in resistance against the German colonialism. At the museum, however, like I said, her name is included in the mass grave. At a point when I was starting to do my PhD, I think around 2012 or 2013, there was a block, in the Majimaji Museum, there are statues that are surrounding the museum. They are replicating the photograph by Father Johannes Africa. So because her photo was not known, there was a post with her name to indicate that she was also one of the victims of the Majimaji resistance. So much as her inclusion in the museum aims to bring awareness that women were also part of this. This was not only a men business. There were women also involved in this process. But the wrongful placement of her makes some of errors related to this more expansive in this process. Her inclusion is actually suppressing the nationalistic story, which is normally the history of men, and also women as only subordinates in this process. But without such particular inclusion, then probably Mkomanile would not have been known at all. Without that wrongfully placement, probably Mkomanile would not have been known at all. But my challenge now is that we need to find the real truth, the real history of her. Yes, her inclusion, we say it is wrong, but then we say it's also helpful that we know that she exists. But then it should not end there. And if there is more information that we need at that particular point, especially relating to the Majimaji Museum, are the information about Mkomanile. Where is her remains? At least a photograph of her to see that this is actually, who she is, and also to find really a story. I am sure that there is somewhere where Mkomanile is detailed But most of the research are privileged men. Songea Mbano, for example, is very well known, so much written about. Even myself, I've written about Songea Mbano. But it is nowadays that I'm realizing that in continue to perpetrate, to continue to write more about these main victims of the Majimaji resistance, we forget the key people in the process, like Khadija Mkomanile. And I will tell you one of the stories that have surfaced in this process of heroizing men and forgetting women in the process. So one of the names that Mkomanile is given is Binti Mkomanile. Binti for Swahili, it is daughter of Binti Mkomanile. So it means daughter of Mkomanile. And it is also believed that Mkomanile was actually a concubine of the ambassador who brought the Maji into Songea. That the relationship between the ambassador and Mkomanile was sexual. It was like a marriage contract or something of that sort. And in these two stories, then you find that as much as we are speaking about women participation in the war, we are also marginalizing their position in the process. Like I said before, Mkomanile was an Nduna. Mkomanile was a sub-chief. This role, this position, is the same as the war governor, Songea Mbano. But the story of concubine, the story of Binti. Binti means daughter. Now, addressing Mkomanile as Binti is reducing Mkomanile to a young lady, someone who is a daughter of. But she was a woman with power. She was a powerful woman who should be addressed as Nduna and not Binti, which is the entry into the archive that has been perpetuated. Even in my own previous writing, I have been calling her Binti for so many years. I have been calling Binti Mkomanile. But then it's when I realized that we are actually perpetuating the story and at the same time undermining the position of women in this resistance. So my really quest here is really the way about. I've already written about challenging the question of calling her Binti, which reduces her power from a sub-chief to just a small lady, a young lady, which is not. And then now we are asking the questions of where exactly is she? What is known about her in terms of the archival document, in terms of the German documentation? I'm sure like all others who were hanged, there is a story to how she was hanged. A priest like Johannes Hafliger, what does he say about Mkomanile, especially before her execution? What does it show, the interaction between Chabruma and Mkomanile before the Majimaji resistance? There are so many stories that are still not yet unveiled and revealed, and would be interesting to actually dig down deep into these stories.
In this research on Mkomanile, what did you gain through talking to the descendants of this woman leader of the Majimaji resistance? I mean, what are the stories you hear? Are they consistent if you talk to several descendants? How much do they remember? How reliable is that piece of oral history in your assessment?
So the prominent one is that a primary school in our village is named after her. So in our village, a primary school is named after her. So it is that school actually commemorates her and her participation in the Majimaji resistance. And so it is not somebody who is not known, because the school is called Mkomanile up to today. But another thing is that the family do not participate. It is nowadays that they have been now requested to participate, and they must be followed. You need to follow them to be able to participate. But before they followed them, actually before I conducted research and revealed that she was not buried there, and that's why even the family does not come to participate in the commemoration. The museum did not even engage them. It was after it was revealed that she was not buried there, and the family actually did not associate with the mass grave which her name was written on. That's when they followed up. So there is this, awareness of saying, no, 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 she wasn't executed there. That memorial does not include her remains, and we cannot participate. So this is also known. It's not something that is a secret. In Kitanda, they know that Nkomanile was not killed where the museum is located, because the museum is an on-site museum where all the victims were buried. And so these are the information that is already known. So the school commemorates her, which makes it not a family memory, but a public memory. And at the same time, there was refraining from participation in the commemorations of the Majimaji victims, mainly because her body is not part of what is commemorated at. So it was like resisting that particular commemoration, de-associating themselves from the commemoration because of, the information that they already have, that ours is not there.
So you're saying the family or her community, they do not have separate or their own rituals of commemorating Nkomanile?
Not that I know of, because at least from talking to them, that was not mentioned to me. But I wouldn't say that there is no at all, and that's mainly because of the experience that I have received elsewhere. So among the Matumbi, when I interviewed them for the first time, they said there was nothing. They didn't even know the location of the grave. They didn't do anything, But during the filming of the documentary, they took me to the grave. They told me that we have been doing this. We have been hiding this grave for so many years because so many human bodies were taken. So we were scared because he was the leader of the resistance. So we were scared that if they know the location of this grave, they will also take away the body. So we have been secretly venerating this grave. And so it was, during the wake of, memorializing, giving people significance and knowledge about it, where the family sat down, discussed, should we really continue to hide this, or should we also give him the position that he had, because he was the Jumbe, Sikwako Mbonde was the Jumbe of the Matumbi. Actually, the German plantation, the cotton plantation, was established in his farm. And so he was actually buried at the proximity of that particular farm, all the way hidden. And that is another controversy, because as a chief, was supposed to be given prominence, to be buried at a space whereby the grave is venerated forever. But he had to be taken to the proximity, very far from the farm, so that this place can be hidden. And even if they go there to pray, nobody is seeing them. It was completely surrounded by a bush. So that was the case for Sikwako Mbonde. From Komanile, physically, they say there's no any, celebration or commemoration that are taking place. At least for now, that's what I know. It's the knowledge I have about that particular place.
In the next section, then, we'll talk about the broader conversations in Tanzania about German colonial rule. Nancy, you have this highly specialized, very broad knowledge of the period of German colonial rule in your country. To what extent is that of interest to the society at large?
So, the German colonialism and colonialism at large is something that is of interest, especially because it's part of our past. It is part of our history. So, nobody can do away with that particular space. But it affects, different communities are affected, differently. And that is also transgenerational and intergenerational. So there are societies, there are communities that are deeply affected, from the eldest to the youngest. And there are part of the community that are trying to, creating amnesia into some of the things. And this is triggered by different culture and perspective. In societies that commemorations have been there for some time, from the young to the elder, these people are completely aware and interacting with these memories on a daily basis. So, for example, communities in Songea, communities in Kilimanjaro, from the youngest to the eldest, these people are actually participants in commemoration of this resistance. There is a tendency, especially in towns, whereby there has been no activism, completely ignoring the colonial period. Monuments are created and people are completely quiet about it. However, there is a way of interacting with this memory. This colonial memory is not talked about, is completely mute. Nobody is engaging with it. So it's not part of the conversation, it's not part of the discussion, but it is deep down in the history of the people. And in parts like Songea, in parts like Matumbi communities in southeastern part, in parts where the churches, where the churches are built, these stories are not completely forgotten. So my recent engagement, for example, in southern east part of Tanzania, among the missionaries, the Benedictine missionaries, the Ndanda region. So many years I've been working with the Ndanda mission, especially in attempt to open the archive that was created by, the German missionaries there. And these archives remained closed for Tanzanians, the replica of which in St. Ottilien open for researchers.
St. Ottilia in Bavaria.
In Bavaria,
That's the
yes.
head office of the missionary Benedictines.
That's right. So that particular one open, the one in Tanzania closed. So we have been in negotiation about how these archives can be opened. And the Tanzania laws on archive allows the missionary to have a private archive. And it says that under certain provision, they can acquire the private archive, but they have to compensate the owner of that private archive. So that is how the law has been, facilitating the missionaries to remain with the archive, which has a people interest, public interest, but then still closed to the public. And my interaction, for example, with the archive, because I use the archive so much, my interaction with the archive in Dar es Salaam indicates some correspondence between the missionaries and the government officials. One of it, for example, the recent encounter was requesting for marble. Ndanda has the big facility for marble. So they quarry marble and
The marble, yes.
They quarry marble, and most of the altars, church altars in Tanzania, are made out of the marble from Ndanda. So the administrators were requesting marble chips from Ndanda, and they were able to provide. So I saw that, that correspondence between the missionaries and in the archive, in the Tanzania National Archive, which already shows that there is a lot of, the part that I was talking about, a relationship between, the colonial administrators and the missionaries. So when I was researching this time, I was researching away from the mission. So I was researching the village nearby the mission. And I was with the student because it was a field school. So I was with the student. We were exploring the region or the villages around the mission and their feeling about the existence of the mission from the past all the way to present. And then we realized the effect that the mission had, especially on the people who were not Christians. So before the missionaries, before the German colonialism, southeastern part of Tanzania was predominantly Muslim, because Islam had entered before Christianity, because it's along the coast and all that ancient history of the coast interaction with, Asia. So because the missionaries came with provisions, education, food, clothing, healthcare, most of the people were forced to convert into Christianity so that they could receive education. And this was part of their life. So they were talking about it, that the schools were not open to Muslims because everything there was in church. It was church related. So if you wanted to retain a Muslim, to retain the Islamic background, you were not welcomed in the church schools. And it reached the point whereby those who were educated could get good jobs and all that. So, and also through coercion from the government administrators, that you need to go to school, you need to go to school. So Islamic villages were invaded, requested, asked, forcibly asked to be, enrolled in schools. So at a particular point, then Muslims started now joining the schools. So this is an interaction that you see at the villages who are still remembering. I was actually, and then you hear a name, for example, Nancy Ismail, or Nancy Selemani, or Nancy Yuma, which indicates, that the father was a Muslim and then the child is a Christian. So you say, what is your name? Someone will give you the first name, Christian, the second name, Muslim, third name, which means the parents who did not go to school were Muslims. But then he went to school, and then he got baptized. And the generation after him then became Christian. Sometimes they even come back to Islamic religion. And that's how the relationship between, the people of southern Tanzania is entangled. And it is very common to see the building of the church sponsored by the Muslims and the building of the mosque sponsored by the Christians. These distinctions in religion are very, very minimal up to the present.
I would like to raise the point to what extent Tanzania government is in support or in any way interacting with the community memory practices for German colonialism. Now you have a national restitution committee. Please provide some assessment where you see the government of Tanzania going on this specific issue.
From the outset, there has not been a smooth relationship between the community and the government. Government institutions have done so many errors in terms of their relationship with the community. One particular example is that of the Majimaji Museum. The Majimaji Museum was
in
Songea, was a community museum established in 1980s by the community. And before the establishment of the museum, it was a graveyard. It was a place for mourning and spiritual, veneration. So it is a holy place among the Ngoni. But then, because of the museum theories and, inclusion of these exhibitions, and some people also, the Ngoni who are learned, the people who got education, advised the community that it would be better if this museum is handled by the government, whereby it will have fund to run the museum and the exhibition to be kept in place and all that, to expand the place. And so they accepted to give it away to the government. The conditions for giving it away were that they will retain ownership, in a sense that if they want to do their spiritual activities, they are allowed to do the mourning ceremonies. But in time, there has been no, consensus in what can be done there and what cannot be done there. To the extent that the collision resulted to the community demanding another space, because that museum was no longer serving their purpose, to be taken to another place where they can construct something of their own. That serves like an example. So with the restitution committee, with the government involved in this, there are so many unresolved issues between the government and the community. Another case is that of Mkwao, who on his own accord discussed with the Charité, requesting the return of the
Charité, the medical institution here in the city of Berlin.
Yes. So negotiated the return of the descendants, of which they have a returned once, returned by the British, which is acknowledged as a wrongful return. So they were about to return the actual, the physical, the physical human bodies of their descendants. But then
The ancestral remains.
the ancestral remains, they were denied to be taken back. So these examples show how the contradiction between the government and the community. There is a lot of unresolved issues between the government and the community. And this is not to exclude scholars, activists, and whoever has interest in this, because there is no guideline which now show the roadmap of which everyone who is dealing with the question of colonialism, restitution, can look at and say that this is the wrong path or this is the right path. Without that particular guideline, then both community and government, activists, scholars are working in silos. Everyone is working on his own. And so there is no stance as we speak of saying the Tanzanian government has this particular approach when it comes to restitution. And this is not only from Germany, it is from any other colonial agency. And some of these are not even colonial agents, but recipients of the colonial goods. Because during colonialism, it was possible to exchange either cultural belongings or human bodies to different countries. So we know for sure that some of these cultural belongings are in Hungary. Hungary has never been a colonizer for Tanzania. We know these are United States of America. So there is no government stance on how this actually should be, handled.
In the final section now, we will turn to your relations and your assessment of German side. Nancy, at the end of 2023, German President Steinmeier went to Tanzania. He visited the Majimaji Museum in Songea, and he delivered an apology for German colonial crimes. What is your response to this act?
From the outset, I saw the apology as a political propaganda. Just from the outset, I could tell that this is something that has been done politically, really for political purposes, than to solve the buried history, the long history of colonialism and its aftermath in Tanzania. The entry into the country, immediately, the first day that the president entered, it was already taken into the diversity or into the direction that the Tanzanian government wanted. That is economic benefit. Just the first day, because the president visited and apologized the second day in Songea. But the first day, the first entrance, the newspapers, everything, already took the coming of the president as a collaboration, economic collaboration. So much as the apology was tendered the second day, already they had built economic collaboration. And this is something that I've already challenged. I challenged it a lot, saying that in the fight against, descendant communities, history of the past to be acknowledged, the government see it as economic opportunity for it to receive grants, to receive aids, to receive whatsoever that is pleasing the government side. So the president was taken to Tanga Cement. The president was taken to startups, youth startups, as, for this was discussed as a future, the future looking, forward looking stance that we should not dwell so much into the past. We should, look into the future. That was the viewpoint. But in reality, the addressing of the community in terms of the atrocities that were conducted during colonialism and the aftermath and what can be done after was taken as secondary. So after we have built the future, then let's address also the past. So from the outset, it was already clear that the apology is not something that will amount into something tangible. It was something that was done politically. And I would say it was to please more of the German side than of the Tanzanian side. First of all, the president did not accompany the other one to the apology and be part of
The
that.
Tanzania president didn't come along to Songea.
The Tanzania president did not come along. And then it was addressed that Tanzania, the German president went to Songea at the invitation of John Mbano, the descendant of Songea Mbano. Now, in Songea, we don't have only one descendant who was affected by this. It is, there are many, even in the mass grave that the president visited and actually memorialized his visit, because he memorialized even his visit. That's another strange thing.
They put up a stone to commemorate the visit of Steinmeier to the museum in Songea.
Yes, yes. Now the president is visiting an empty museum. The Umbodt Forum only is holding 10,000 of Majimaji War goods that were looted during the Majimaji War. What the Majimaji Museum is in the museum, it's showcasing, is replicas, things that are created to imitate, what was, part of the Majimaji resistance. Now, visiting that particular space without any action afterwards is completely mockery. So that's my reaction to that particular visit. It did not amount to anything tangible that we can see. The family of Songea Mbano is still searching, even itself alone, it is still searching for the remains of Mbano, which are nowhere to be found as yet. So many other families are still grieving, like I've talked about Komanile, who we don't know the story or the problems that are faced. Songea was taken as a platform to apologize for all, for all the wrongs that were done in Tanzania. Yes, it was taken as a platform because it wasn't possible to go to every region apologizing. Yes, symbolically, that's okay. But memorializing the visit is not something that is acceptable. And also not doing anything immediately afterwards is also something that is completely unacceptable. So when you say about the relationship, we still have a long way to go. There is a lot of activities that are still going on. Like I talked about the missionaries trying to open. We also saw the missionaries in Leipzig who also exposed, through research, and especially archival research, which was able to expose that missionaries were directly involved in, purchasing, in selling human bodies, acquiring and selling.
In Germany, to German museums.
In German museums. So missionaries as direct collaborators of Felix van Luschen.
The director of the Berlin Ethnological Museum.
Yes. So we see, because without these researches, without these collaborations, all these would have been buried. So we see a very good effort in terms of, exposing the wrongs. But correcting the wrongs, that's where we have a big challenge. Because correcting the wrongs would be repatriation, repatriation of what was looted from, Tanzania, belongings of the people, and also the human bodies. To some of these communities, these human bodies are venerated. Some attribute their calamities into the absence of these human bodies. Some people are going mental. Some people have no life at all because of this absence of the proper, graves of their descendants. Some of the belongings were so important that even the kingdom, the entire community, is seen as, empty without these belongings. And so to acknowledge the wrong without correcting the wrong is still wrong.
So the repatriation of ancestral remains, restitution of cultural belongings, that would be key elements for you in demonstrating a genuine readiness to address the painful past from the German side.
That's right.
How about the dino in the Berlin Natural History Museum? To what extent would you include natural history objects or botanical objects? Are they part of the big story?
These are elements. These are elements that, come to the equation when it comes to restitution. And it becomes very big because it's not restitution of, human, bodies and belongings. It comes to our knowledge that so many things were taken. So I'll tell you, one time I visited Leipzig Museum.
Yeah, the Grassi Museum in Leipzig.
Grass, yes. And during that particular time, there was an exhibition of Hans Meyer.
Yes, Hans Meyer.
Yes, and the looted top of Mount Kilimanjaro. You see, the looted cap of Mount Kilimanjaro. And in that museum, I remember,
he had taken it away and half of it donated to the German emperor. The other half he kept to himself.
That's right. So when I entered there, they were doing like a fundraising, creating replicas. So you visit the museum, you see how they're creating the replicas. And if you purchase the replica, you are actually donating towards the finding of the other half, because one was actually, I think, lost, and then they were looking for the other part. And I'm fond of buying souvenirs. When I go, I buy things that will remind me. But I wasn't ready to buy one from the Grassi Museum, not because I don't support the cause, but it was perplexing. Now it reminds you of if they took an empty stone that just dusted a stone from Mount Kilimanjaro, how many minerals did we lose through that entire process? We have so many places. For example, as archaeologists, we have a problem. When we excavate, especially for me, who is excavating around colonial sites, either bombers, churches, abandoned, normally my context is disturbed. Immediately I set the trench, start to excavate. The following day, when we close the camp and go home, the following day you find that they have quarried more than where you left. Because they believe that there were things that were buried that the Germans left in hurry. The Germans were evicted in hurry. So they buried some money, some minerals, in these buildings.
That would be the local community would come in and try to...
Yes. So they believe that you have discovered where the treasure was hidden and you have started to excavate. So it takes so much time to educate. So you request a village meeting so that you can address the question. That's when they will stop at least disturbing your context. But this is the belief that so much was looted. And the people do know, at least they imagine, that so much was taken in that. So speaking about the Berlin, the Natural History Museum with the dino, it is also in question. And there is also something maybe I need to address. There's so many issues that are going on when it comes to, to these questions. And if they are not looked at properly, they completely destroy the spirit. So much as the dinosaur is here, the region where the dino came from, they only have a statue indicating that this is where the dino was taken from. Now the site where the dino was taken from, the dino bones, all these, it is actually a ritual site. It is a ritualized site. It's not just a mere site where you excavate and go.
By the community?
By the community.
Why would they have rituals over this?
The site, because of the nature of the nature of the ancestors who were found there.
Is it related to the dinos or to their own people, to the ancestors?
In spaces. So, for example, the mountain Kilimanjaro is considered a ritual place. So, looking at it, because of the snow, because of the tallness, because it's considered a ritual. It is a ritual place. There is a ritual even. You can't bury facing this. You can't bury facing either the mountain. You can't. There are rituals of that nature. So, the existence of the dinosaur bones in that area. Remember, they excavated in Tuksam. They are still there. A lot of bones are still within the site, and archaeologists at the University of Dar es Salaam have actually visited the site and conducted research around it. And some of these actual bones are at the University of Dar es Salaam as part of that particular excavation. So it is not a space that was extracted bones for the Berlin, and we know that it's not only the Berlin natural history. They were taking more. They were more than, they are more than what is in Berlin. There are more dinosaur bones that were shipped to Germany than what is mounted in the Natural History Museum. So also at home, the remains are still there, and that site, because of that particular feature, is not considered as a normal place. It is considered as a ritual place. So it is a ritual site, right? And now, to imagine that these statues are the one in the roundabout of the region. This is one of the regions that I said were the poorest.
And also as an aftermath of the Majimaji War, right?
Yes, at the aftermath of Majimaji War, because that region was completely ignored. And even the post-colonial government, the government of Tanzania, continue marginalizing the region. That is because it was that particular area that was given to Mozambique during the liberation movement. It has proximity to Mozambique. And so Nyerere thought that exposing that particular area will bridge the gap between the Portuguese, will give the easy entrance of the Portuguese from Mozambique to Tanzania and be able to invade the camp at Farm 17. That's where they were hidden.
So there would be the Frelimo, the armed liberation movement of Mozambique.
Yes, Frelimo. That's where Frelimo was hidden. Remember, Tanzania supported some of these southern African countries during the liberation movement. And so all the way to 1980s, this area was completely abandoned, not developed at all. So from 1980s onward, the development we are taking slowly. But it is not comparable. It's not comparable to other parts of the country. And so it is very poor. When you reach there, they tell you that this is the town, and it's all of it. And it's a very beautiful space. It has the Indian Ocean, and it's one of the best ports. It's the best port in Tanzania. It's the region with the best port.
What's the name of the town?
Lindi.
The Lindi.
Yes, it's Lindi. It's one of the best ports in Tanzania. So it is a sleeping giant. Nothing is going on in Lindi. Nowadays, there are other, companies, foreign companies, even NUF. Is it called NUF? We have a company called NUF for gypsum, and there is a German company in that particular area actually producing, I think, gypsum boards and all that. Yes. So industrial-wise, especially in terms of cement and the gypsum, and nowadays there is a graphite. Also, all these, it's now coming a little bit up for minerals. But the cry of the people is that all these are exploration to be taken and be sold somewhere else. So the development of the local people around, is very minimal, is very marginalized.
So the dino and possible return of the dino, would that be a sort of a unifying demand or position of Tanzania as a nation? Is it of that key relevance or symbolic relevance?
Yes, at all. That's the fact that the people, of Tanzania have never seen that. They have never seen something amounting to that. What they have are these replicas. Even the National Museum has the, metal replica there. So the fact that the people of Tanzania missed that knowledge completely. There was a time my Professor Sanane and I think Msiba wrote a book in Swahili speaking. The book is called Dinosauria Watendaguru. It's a Swahili book, Dinosauria Watendaguru. The aim was to try and see, that children, especially at a young age, and that's why it is in Swahili, because Tanzania primary school is in Swahili, then you learn English as you go. So it was written in Swahili mainly to capture the attention of the young children, to be aware of these, the dinosaurs, that there is such a creature that was once discovered here in Tanzania, and it's one of its kind. But this knowledge is completely not in Tanzania. But here, the children of Berlin get to see and expand the imagination of these, past that we're talking about. So for a department like archaeology, it's a shame that there is actually nothing that we have done in terms of, negotiating this collaboration between Tanzania and Germany. Even visits for children to visit and see, because it's here. Then there should be a negotiation of how children can visit here, or otherwise be repatriated back home and be installed at the National Museum. Now there is one thing that has always been a challenge. That is, where will you put it? This thing takes a lot of space. Your museum is like a store. Where will you put that ginormous thing? There should be provision. And I'm sure if the dinosaur is repatriated, it will find a space. It will definitely find a space where it will be kept. And also it will be cared for, because sometimes we are questioned about the care. Will you be able to give it the care? It will be given the care that it deserves, because it's not the only thing that we have. This is also the same with any other thing, botanical garden, and I always leave a space that there is still a lot that was looted from, Tanzania and elsewhere in Africa that are yet to be known. And so we are waiting to discover so many things. We discover a lot in terms of, what was looted, and the nature of what was looted is not binded to.
As we have come to the conclusion of our conversation, are there any ideas and thoughts that you would want to bring in at this point? No. Okay, so I thank you very much for this very inspiring and deep conversation, dear Nancy.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Thomas.